This meeting is being recorded.
There you go. All right. Well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. And we'll start off as per normal with a little bit of the news from the solar industry for this week, the week of January 23rd. Some of the highlights here are that Solar Edge is announcing that they are in fact beginning to ship from their South Korean facility the NEC batteries. So they've been going into trying to have their own batteries available with their systems. And NEC is lithium, nickel, manganese, cobalt. Now, one of the criticisms of that particular technology has in the past been that it's not as long-lived as some of the other technologies. Although Solar Edge is claiming in their product announcements that these things have 800 or 8,000 cycles, where if you divide that by 365, that's going to be about 22 years. So we'll wait to see if you really do get a 22-year life cycle out of these batteries. The other advantages of this particular technology is they do have a high energy density. They do allow for very high power throughput on those batteries, and they operate in a wide range of temperatures. This is one of the reasons why NMC is used as the majority of electric vehicles use that technology. The downside is the materials used, the cobalt and I think the nickel, mined primarily in Russia and the Congo. So there's a lot of sourcing issues with the product that goes into it. They also do have thermal runaway, which if you've read about these lithium batteries, when they're damaged, combusting, well, that's the issue. So a number of manufacturers are shifting over to lithium iron phosphate. So we'll just see how this plays out. But Solar Edge, the news is they're now shipping their own batteries for their systems. Company called Hoymiles, I think that's how you pronounce it, Hoymiles, Hoymiles. They're announcing a low-cost 4-port 2 MPPT microinverter system. So they're claiming it's low cost, although in all of the material that I looked for, I couldn't find anybody talking about just how much these things cost. But when I looked at other 4-port or 4-module input microinverters, they seem to cost in the $300 to $400 range. So I assume that this particular one, since they're claiming it's low cost, is going to be in that range or lower. They're having 3 essentially flavors for this. 1600 volt amp, which will connect up to 4 panels that are between 320 and 540 watts. Then there's an 1800 volt amp system that hooks up to 360 through 600s, and then a 2000 volt amp microinverter, which seems an amazing thing, a 2 kW microinverter that will hook up to 400 to 670 watt panels. And they do claim that these do have a efficiency of around 96.7%. So obviously now the downside of something like this is because it hooks up to 4 panels, but it only has 2 maximum power point tracking. Then you're going to find that if shading occurs on 1 panel, it's going to affect 2 panels. But, the downside there, you'd assume these would be in a relatively unshaded environment, but you're saving a lot of upfront cost as opposed to having 1 microinverter for every panel. Then I found a lot of discussion out there about virtual power plants. So I thought I'd highlight just a couple of things that are going on. And I just find this interesting because it demonstrates how much the industry is changing. It used to be we just talked about solar panels and inverters and how to hook them up, how to put them on the roof. But now we're starting to see how virtual power plants come into the equation. So Octopus Energy has penned a deal with Enphase in the state of Texas to essentially create virtual power plants by aggregating all of these battery systems that are operating through Enphase And then that allows them to sell power back to ERCOT in Texas during peak load demand periods. And so Octopus has been involved in something similar to this in Texas, where they have a deal with consumers to go in and manage their thermostat. So they pay these consumers $25 a month towards their electric bill. In exchange, Octopus can then go in and through a smart thermostat, lower the temperature settings on the thermostat by 3 degrees for a period of 2 hours. So that's the arrangement. They can come in, lower your thermostat 3 degrees for 2 hours at a time. And in exchange, that helps to balance the grid a bit. Obviously, during summer months when there's high air conditioning demand, and then they get paid by the Texas utilities for lowering that peak load demand. Because during peak load demand times, the cost of energy to the utility can be very significant. So if you can begin to do this load management. So basically Octopus is saying, okay, we've been doing load management for a while. Now we're going to get into some supply management where we essentially have a virtual power plant and we can feed into the grid either during hot weather, when air conditioning, or Texas has had those problems with cold temperatures, wiping out some of the natural gas and coal supply. So it's interesting. And they're talking about expanding this throughout other states. Well, we're going to see a lot of companies doing this. Companies like Tesla are already planning to aggregate the battery power of Tesla vehicles and provide that as a virtual power plant. And then there's another virtual power plant in the world that just made an announcement, Intertrust Group. And Intertrust Group is a Dutch company. It's been around since 1952, and it's a very large business management company. And they're working with a company, I don't know how it's pronounced. I think it's EIP Grid, would be my guess, but it's a South Korean company that has been involved in distributed energy resource management. So essentially working with utilities on how to coordinate distributed energy that's hooked up to the grid. So these two are coming into play together to try and create a hyper secure global platform upon which virtual power plants can rest within this platform to avoid, to deal with the cybersecurity issues that are involved in something like this. So just interesting to see how global this is and how some of the big players are coming into that marketplace with virtual power plants. And that's pretty much the news for this week. It's been pretty slow as far as regulatory. So does anybody have any questions regarding the news that's been occurring this week, or what I just highlighted, or anything to add?
I would definitely want to follow up that virtual power plant relationship with NFEs. Sounds interesting.
Yeah. I know, Devin, and you're down in Trinidad. So it would be interesting because, well, I don't know how it would work because your systems are not connected to the grid down there. So this is something that you're taking all of these independent battery systems, amalgamating, aggregating them, and then pumping them back onto the grid. So don't think it'll come to your neck of the woods soon.
No, not yet. But good connectivity is around the corner in my country. It's not far.
Okay, good. All right. Any other questions on news of the week? All right. So let me. I thought what we would do. I'll try and get my head out of the graphics there. Talk a little bit about some of the changes in the 2023 National Electrical Code, and specifically the ones that affect solar, but maybe touch on a few others. And again, I've done some research on this, but I don't want to pretend that I'm the world's leading expert on the National Electrical Code. So if I say something that doesn't make sense, or that to be different than that, just chime in. We're just trying to all get a sense of what's changing. From what I found, just kind of a quick overview, most of the changes have been stylistic. They're moving definitions to a specific chapter, or they're shifting things around. But there are some substantive changes that are in there as well. So let's jump in where the article, mine is covered up there. I don't know the numbers. Anyway, it has to do with high voltage systems. And we've discussed for a while how we in the United States, residential is limited to 600 volts. Commercial, basically on buildings, limited to 1,000 volts. And then ground mounted systems could be up to 1,500 volts. There's seems, at least in my mind, no reason for these limitations. They're in Europe, you can be as high as 1,500 volts on a residence. So the higher the voltage, the lower the cost is going to be for that installation, because you can do fewer strings, you can have smaller wire, because higher the voltage, the lower the amperage. So there's some significant cost savings that can be found by increasing the voltage. But the National Electrical Code has been hesitant to increase this. I'm wondering, what they've done is they said, okay, with this round, we're still going to limit residential 1 and 2 family dwellings to 600 volts DC. We're also going to still limit anything that is on a building to 1,000 volts DC. So that's commercial and multifamily. And then they set up a new article for anything greater than 1,000 volts. So that's 690.31. And I think it says it was 1,000 volts AC and 1,500 volts DC. Well, within the US, within the market right now, there really aren't any systems available that to those people who install these size systems that are greater than 1,500 volts. So it's kind of a solution, at least in the PV industry, in search of an application. But of course, there are other applications out there, not photovoltaics, that deal in those higher voltages. But they've defined then, if you do put a system that is greater than 1,000 volts on a building, then it has to be less than 10 feet above grade. And it cannot, the panels themselves cannot be more than 10 meters or about 33 feet from the equipment to which they're connected. So in this case, they're talking about unoccupied buildings. So I'm not quite sure the above grade issue, why that is. I didn't see any explanation as to the rationale behind this, but it seems like they're beginning to set up some applications or some definitions that will lead in future cycles to higher voltage systems. I don't know if they're doing this just because of photovoltaics. I kind of doubt it, but it may be setting that up so that we can begin to see higher voltage systems in the marketplace for PV. Then, as I mentioned, this new article, there's really no available systems over the 1,500 volts, but they do get into some fairly significant definitions as to, such as, separation between the wires, the protection against touching the energized parts or connections, clearances. There was a whole section on windows to look in to monitor the connections without actually having to open it up or look at them. So we'll see if this is a move to higher voltage systems in the future. Another change in the 690 chapter has to do with rapid shutdown. And rapid shutdown is better defined than it's been in the past. There aren't really any changes to what you're allowed to do or what you're not allowed to do, but they've tried to make some definitions a little clearer. For example, people ask me about this all the time. For unoccupied, they're basically defined it as non-enclosed detached structures. So really you're talking about a carport or some other structure that's used for a purpose, but is not enclosed and it's detached from the dwelling unit. then no rapid shutdown is required. So rapid shutdown in this instance typically means that when you turn off the disconnect switch, the main disconnect for the PV array, that the energized conductors stop at the array effectively. There's a lot of other things there, but it's got to be within 1 foot of the array boundary, no more, no power greater than, trying to think, I think it's 30 volts. That might not be right. But anyway, basically, so for firemen, so they're not injured or killed because they think that the power is off, but then they cut through a live wire. So they want that to shut down at the array. So they're saying, okay, these electronic devices that you have to hook up to make this happen, the module level power electronics, are not required if you're installing it on a detached carport. Also, I guess there was some confusion, and it never occurred to me that if I had a ground mounted system, excuse me, well, ground mounted systems don't have to have rapid shutdown. But what happens if you bring those wires up to an occupied building and attach the inverter to the building? Well, they're saying, okay, in those situations, rapid shutdown's not required. So they're defining things a little bit better. They also got into cable trays and discussing how you would install cable trays for photovoltaics. Prior to 2014, we weren't allowed to use open cable trays. You are allowed now, and they're just better defining how those cable trays can be used. A lot of changes. They always love to do this. Changes in labeling. They're just removing unnecessary words. The one that they wanted to focus on a lot has to do with rapid shutdown. The rapid shutdown label was very specific, you know, prior to the 2014 code. I mean, if it was the 2014 code, it was a red thing, had certain wording. After that, the 2017, it was yellow and it had certain wording. Well, now they're kind of saying, listen, it doesn't have to be a specific color. You can make your own label. So that's basically where all the labeling changes. I didn't think it was worthwhile highlighting each and every one of those changes. Then, because these people love to nitpick on terminology, when we study in class, we basically said for a simple grid-tied system, there's the PV source circuit that goes from the array to the combiner box or the junction box. Then from the junction box or combiner box to the DC disconnect that's near the inverter, that's the PV output circuit. Then from that disconnect, it's the inverter input circuit, and then the AC side of the system is the inverter output circuit. Well, they've done away with the PV output circuit. That terminology is no longer considered acceptable as far as the code is concerned. They've talked now about PV source circuits and PV string circuits, and the PV source circuit might be a PV string circuit, or it might not be. If you're combining in parallel in a combiner box, from that point forward, it would no longer be a PV string circuit. But if you're going from a string to an inverter, which we oftentimes do, and you might have multiple strings coming from the array to an inverter because of multiple maximum power point tracking, those would be PV source or PV string circuits. But if it's connected in parallel, it would be a PV source circuit. But if it is connected to a power optimizer, for example, from the optimizer to the DC disconnect, that would be referred to as a PV DC to DC converter circuit. Oh, makes everything so wonderful. And the explanation there is they were saying, like, the PV source circuit and the PV string circuit, they were referring to it as like wild PV. Basically, it's subjected to the additional 1.25 multiplier when you're figuring out safety on the sizing of those strings, because it's subject to the flexibility or to the fluctuations in irradiance that happen, you know. So your module specifications are based on 1,000 watts per square meter, but you might have as much as 1200. So you multiply, because the not only the NEC 1.25 safety margin, but you multiply it times another 1.25. But if it's connected to a power optimizer, from that point forward, all of the fluctuations are dealt with by the electronic device. So that is no longer a wild circuit. It will not fluctuate. So the PV DC to DC converter circuit is being differentiated, because now you would not put that second 1.25 multiplier when you're sizing the wire. So they're just making it a little more confusing, but I guess there's a rationale behind that.
Is this for the 2020 NEC?
No, the 2023.
2023, okay.
Yeah, it's already out, but
we're still at 17 in
Florida. Yeah, I'm surprised you guys aren't in the 20, or in the 1943 NEC down there. So it'll be a while before you hit the 2023. Another thing in the 2023 code, I had heard the rumor that they were going to require GFCI outlets in all outlets in the home from starting with the 2023. Well, they didn't require that. But what they did require is in the kitchen. Before, it was just kitchen countertop outlets that had to have the GFCI outlets. Now, every single outlet in the kitchen has to have GFCI outlets. They also, of course, essentially anywhere where there's water has to have a GFCI outlet. So if there are tubs, showers, sinks, anything near that has to have GFCI. All of the bathroom outlets have to be GFCI. All of the kitchen outlets have to be GFCI. Any part of the home that's below grade, so a basement, has to be GFCI. Everything in the basement, anything outside has to be protected. So they're expanding this out quite a bit. They also announced that they will recognize 10 amp branch circuits. I hadn't even realized, apparently before, 15 amp branch circuits were the smallest amperage that the NEC recognized in a traditional service panel. Now they're saying that you can go down to a 10 amp circuit, but only in very specific cases, like lighting. I think another one was exhaust fans. That could be a 10 amp circuit. There was one other one, but I don't remember what it was. But anyway, that's just interesting that they've done that. And something that we're going to be faced with electric vehicle charging stations, what they've added into this code is that when you wire a charging station, it has to be rated for 7,200 volt amps or the nameplate capacity of the system that's being installed, whichever is larger. So basically they're saying if it's a 240 volt charging station, minimum ampacity is going to be 30 amps. So, but if you're putting in, for instance, the Ford Lightning, that has an 80 amp charging station. So you'd have to have an 80 amp circuit for that at minimum. So they're beginning to define that. I suspect that's going to keep going up, but at the moment, smallest you can do is 30 amps.
So if somebody has one of those EFC equipment that is rated for 16 amps, which you do find some level 2 chargers for, the circuit wiring and the breaker size and everything had to be rated at the 30 amps, 32 amps.
Yeah. Yeah, they didn't make a differentiation between like the level 1 charger, like you're talking about, which would be the 120 volt system, would still have to be on 30 amp wire, which effectively 10 gauge wire for something like that. So you couldn't hook it up to just a standard 12 gauge 20 amp circuit. Even though it would work, that would no longer be appropriate. So if you're following the 2023 code, which as Siggy pointed out, may be 6 years before it hits. I don't know, in Trinidad, do they follow the National Electrical Code? Is that your guidance?
We Electrical wiring in Trinidad and Tobago is based upon British standard BS 70, 76, 71. But however, when it comes to renewable energy systems, it is based upon National Electrical Code. So there's a two different kind of codes we operating right now in Trinidad.
Okay, well, that makes everything easy when you get to follow two different standards, right? Okay. All right. Any other comments on the National Electrical Code issues there? Yeah, Bruce?
Jay, did they mention anything about tamper-resistant outlets?
I think I saw something about that, but I didn't highlight it. So it didn't seem to be something, it was outside my area of expertise. So do you have some insight on that?
I just saw something about it, and I just wondered, they were combining them, I believe, with GFIC as well.
Oh, okay.
So, you know, it's kind of there. I guess we have maybe two different kinds of GFICs. I don't know.
Yeah, I also looked in there because I had heard rumors about cybersecurity being integrated into the NEC really for the first time. And they talked about in some of the early drafts putting in a section on cybersecurity. But when I started looking through the code, really only found one reference sort of buried in there. They're essentially saying if you're going to install something with sensitive emergency circuits, you know, like then you should consult or think about cybersecurity. So it seemed to be kind of a, you know, a motherhood and apple pie kind of statement that didn't have any real meat behind it, something that we have to worry about. So at least this time. Next time, who knows? So any other questions on the code?
Yeah, Bill Swan.
Let me jump in so I can see if anybody's raising hands here. Yes, okay, William.
Yeah, I have used the Harmiles 4-in-1s. The cost is obviously less because there's 4 inverters, you know, 4 panels instead of 1 panel per in phase. Second thing is in the next Houston Electric Car Club meeting, HEAA.org, we are going to interview someone from Octopus Energy. And the third item I just mentioned, any idea why the EVSE are bumping up from 3,600 to 7,200 watts? I mean, I typically use a 3,600 watt unit for my electric vehicle, and I'll just state for those that perhaps don't know, there's a communication between the EVSE and the car. The EVSE tells the car how much power to draw to protect the wires feeding the EVSE. You know, there's a digital communication that occurs. But yeah, I suppose they're increasing the watts of the EVSE because all EVs are trending. You know, as you mentioned, the Ford Lightning to 80 amps, and that's 19,000 watts.
Right.
But any reason why this is in the National Electric Code? Is that correct?
Yes, in the 2023. I don't know. I see Tony's on here. Maybe I could make a wild guess, but Tony is in the world of charging stations. Tony, do you have any insight into why they're doing that?
I just caught the last part of the question, Jay. Could you rephrase it?
Yeah, in the electric vehicle charging station circuits in the 2023 code, they've raised that up to 7,200 watt minimum, which you know, or whatever the wattage or the amperage is of the charging unit being attached. So they're basically clearly anticipating higher amp charging station requirements.
That's exactly right. So the short answer is that, like all forms of technology, EV charging and EVs are no exception. There's just like an arms race, right? For more juice, faster charging, trying to future-proof things, trying to look at what's around the corner. and so that we don't do a big build out on infrastructure that's obsolete in 2 years.
Yeah.
The similar, like, I mean, this is a little bit more nerdy, but like nominal voltage for EVs is, base is around 400 volts, and folks are talking about 800 volts, right? So it's just like it's all an arms race, right? It's to like how can we do this better, faster? What does the future look like in 5 years and in 10 years? Not trying to super overbuild a bunch of stuff, but also trying not to spend a bunch of money in infrastructure upgrades and then have it be completely obsolete in 2 years.
Okay, and Bill had mentioned that at least his charging station senses the wire size or the ampacity rating and monitors accordingly. I guess my impression is probably not every charging station does that.
I don't. So it should. So there's a tremendous amount of communication that takes place digitally from the car to the charger. And so this is what, when people talk about the different standards, so CHAdeMO, which is the Japanese standard that's going away, CCS, combined charging standard, which is becoming like the global agreed upon standard, and then you've got Tesla. Those are really your three dominant communications protocols, and all of that is like just a fancy way of saying, like, how are we going to figure out what all of these EVs are going to look like from a charging perspective? It's essentially like the Phillips and Flathead. Like, how are we going to standardize something so that this is not just a complete disaster? That's true for both like the actual physical head of the charging cable all the way down. And this is more specific to that particular question, which is like, there's an entire communications software handshake that occurs before a vehicle will allow a charger to push juice to the battery. And obviously that's done on the vehicle side to prevent the destruction or degradation of the battery in the vehicle. And so the vehicle kind of acts like a traffic cop through the CCS protocol to say, like, hey, what do you guys got? Okay, we'll offer you this much. Okay, here's how much we need. Okay, you can send this much. Ready in 3, 2, 1, send it. Okay, now stop. And that communication is done on the vehicle side.
Okay, well, we talked about in previous sessions, since we're on the idea of charging stations for a second, there seems to be several things that have not yet shaken out in the marketplace, such as, are we going to go with a DC charging from the charger, or is it going to be AC and then have the rectifying take place in the vehicle? So it's basically an extension cord. And then with the integration of the auto transfer switch, if we're going to use vehicles as battery backup, that seems to be something that would be built into the charging station as well, to disconnect from the grid if the vehicle becomes your battery backup for your house. So those two items, is there any movement, Tony, in is everything going to be DC to DC to the vehicle, or is it going to be, AC and then everything take place in the vehicle? Where are we going with what do you see as the trends?
So it's such a phenomenal question. The short answer is that it is still very much the Wild West.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this depends on, just like any technological breakthrough or innovation or adoption cycle, you've got entrenched interests of people who do a thing now and they want their thing to be the thing moving into the future. And then you've got other folks who are trying to, do their thing and scale their thing into the future. What I'll say is, like, so my company, so ZAR is very much like Team DC for a variety of reasons that we won't have to nerd out on this call. But the way that we look at things is like, all right, the electrification of transportation is happening, just so happens to be occurring. That revolution is happening at the same time. Solar and storage are also kind of taking off. And so we think, if we look at these things holistically, solar DC, stationary batteries DC, charging of an electric vehicle because it's a battery DC. Let's keep, for efficiency's sake, if you're, let's generate energy as close as possible from the point of consumption, so you don't have to worry about these losses in long distance transmission lines or anything. Generate solar on your roof or in your parking lot. Use it in a battery in your garage or in your parking lot, and charge a vehicle in your garage or in your parking lot. That's kind of how we look at things. And you can do a whole bunch of awesome stuff when that happens, right? Not only just a lot of things get simplified and cheaper, which is like the so what, not just like nerdy academic power electronic stuff, but the so what to normal people is things become a lot more efficient, a lot cheaper, and you can start to remove large costs from the vehicle if you take the onboard charger from an electric vehicle off board, right? So for those of you that don't know, just not to insult anybody's intelligence, but right now there's a device in electric vehicles that will do the flipping from AC to DC to charge the battery. And then when you do DC charging, you bypass that onboard charger and go direct DC, direct to the battery. So the short answer is, we're under NDA with some pretty large auto companies, and I'll without naming names, I'll just tell you right from the source that they are looking at ways to sidestep the onboard charger to make the electric vehicle significantly cheaper. So that's Team DC. Now the Team AC, the straw to the steel man, the counter argument is, hey, microinverters are a thing. Right now, they're the most popular. Having everything be grid tied is what happens. Therefore, it's what we should build an ecosystem around. A lot of our stationary batteries are AC coupled. Let's just keep on Team AC and let's scatter a bunch of glorified extension cords all over the place for the charging network, and then call it a day. And so those are like the two camps right now. But nothing absolute. Anyone who tells you that there's like we are conclusively in one direction or another is lying to you, because it's very much the Wild West from both large corporations' perspective all the way down to startups.
I would assume vehicle to load is also an argument for the AC, that you have the inverting take place in the vehicle when you've got these Ford Lightnings out there running chop saws and the like.
Yeah, it's exactly. So it's like, how much, are we going to make electric vehicles way more expensive because we're overbuilding them to be able to be all things for all people and all these cool applications? Or are we going to, or is the strategy to make them as cheap as possible and then let all of your other lickies and chewies or your own particular life or work circumstances dictate what you want out of the vehicle? And that's still very much, you see that with airlines, right? It's like a bottom barrel prices, but you pay for your seat and, whether or not you can, push down your armrest when everything's a la carte. Maybe that's the model that they go with, or maybe the vehicle is the super toy that can do all things. It's just it's still very much up in the air. Okay.
Devanan, you had a comment, and then I see Bill has a comment as well.
Yeah, Tony, as you just mentioned a while ago, you were saying there were some looks at moving the supply voltage for DC fast chargers from 400 to around the 800 volts. Is that really a consideration?
It is. Yeah, it's not. It is very. It's early. It's under consideration, I think, is a great way of phrasing it. It's not a thing that's. I'm not saying it's going to be here tomorrow, but it's a thing that auto companies are looking at. Moving that baseline from 400 to 800.
Is that for the level 3 charging stations only?
Correct.
Really?
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
So my concern is, Tony, I mean, most three-phase, at least in my country, is around 400, 480, 400. But how that would affect companies, organization now have to redo our supply or request a separate supply for 800 volts? Because I would have seen that if you put in a EV vehicle with let's say 100 and something kilowatt hour battery bank, the utilities will want to make sure that the facilities have the capacity to supply that in the first place. So it's not just raising the voltage, but it also have to look at transformers from the incoming supply to the building to see if there's any capacity. So for me, it looked like it's good maybe in the voltage, but it would involve some cost, obviously, with companies and organizations that putting on DC fast chargers that might be operating beyond the standard 400 volts. I don't know. That's my thought on it.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I completely agree with your assessment. I don't. If it is going to be a thing, I think it'll be a kind of maybe a kind of a future thing. I mean, there's not to belabor this point. Obviously, everyone on this call understands this, but like there's so many different complexities happening simultaneously. It's hard to be the shepherd herding all of the cats. Because at the same time you have all of this happening, you also have innovations happening on the battery side, which is obviously a pretty critical part of this. And there's like, there's that's a whole wild west. The battery chemistry alone is a whole wild west of what's going to be scaled and when. That directly relates to the charging infrastructure and how we're optimizing all of this, and passing that down to the end kind of site host or end user. So all of this is very much, the plane is still being built in flight. What I'll say to just not kind of just throw chaos grenades is, at a minimum, as it stands right now, things are starting to really take off. So as a minimum threshold, I think we should focus on deploying what we know is now and around the corner, and not like wringing our hands and trying to over optimize something that may or may not happen 10 years from now.
Okay. Well, Tony, you need to get your act together and get these standards finished, you know?
No, I've been slacking.
Okay.
I take full responsibility.
Yep. Well, William, you had a question?
Yeah, I listed in the chat 3 companies that are looking into V2G. I think you can buy a product now, assuming the car supports that. And I will mention that at a future HEAA meeting, we presumably will interview some or more of these companies remotely.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Yeah, Joe?
Yeah, I'm just curious, how long is it going to take to charge an EV with 800 volts?
Depends on the size of the battery, I'm sure. Any response there, Tony? These fast chargers, my understanding is a lot of when people are using them on the road, they're not necessarily looking at charging to 100%, right? They're going to use these to charge to 80%, say, in a very short time.
Yeah, so I'll send out Jay, I'll send out a graphic to you that was in the battery report that I think is extremely helpful in understanding how to think about the charging of a battery. You're exactly right. There's different auto companies for their EVs have different battery chemistries and different strategies, but to oversimplify it, it's dump a bunch of energy on to charge pretty quickly, but then you'll see across the board, you'll see some light drop off, like gradual drop off, and some a direct drop off a cliff, as far because you don't want to be pushing a tremendous amount of energy towards the last 10, 20, even 30% of your battery. So there's initially a big pop, and then it levels off or drops off pretty quickly. And I'll send that graphic to you, Jay.
Yeah, I think the terms, as I understand it, is constant current, constant voltage, where it takes the current up to a set point, like a big fire hose dump. And then once it reaches that voltage, it begins to lower the current as the voltage remains the same. So the first 80% might only take, I don't know, to be exaggerating, maybe 15 minutes to charge, and the remaining 20% might take 3 hours or 4 hours, to get that last bit of charge. So, any other questions there?
Yeah, last one, Tony. If you're trying to run a DC fast charger at that kind of voltage, let's say you're doing a PV solution, do they have inverters running the 800 volts output?
I'm sure maybe somebody does somewhere, but I'm not familiar with any.
Yeah, and of course we talked at a previous call about if you're dealing with a utility, the demand charges that are significant to deal with these large amounts of power over relatively short periods of time, and how a fast charging station could have significant impact on your monthly utility bill, really far out of sync with the amount of energy you're using. So, all right. Any other questions before we call it a day?
So Jay, with the fact of 800 volts, are people, I'm seeing on Facebook in some of the groups where people are doing like 78 panels of 400 watts to cover basically what the charging wattage would be for a Tesla. Does that make sense? And are they doing it via grid microinverters, or?
well, I think when you're talking about a level 3 fast charger, you're not really talking about a residential application for sure. So that's just, this is more for those people who are doing the commercial level, fast charging stations. So I think there you're, as Devin had pointed out, you may be dealing with different levels of equipment and transformers and all of those kind of things that just aren't going to be jumping into a residential setting. Residential, we're usually using level 1 or level 2 charging stations, which operate at 120 or 240. It's like when you, and these charging stations, the level 3 charging stations are not cheap. I mean, certainly would probably, well, I said certainly would probably, but probably cost more than your solar array, just for that level 3 charging station.
Okay.
So that's why Tony's going to be wealthy. We're all counting on it. So, all right. Any other comments? Okay. Well, thanks everybody for your attention, and we'll see you next Tuesday. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.